It all started in a room where silence was meant to carry authority. The judge's gavel, polished by years of habit, sat like a weapon of finality on the bench. The cameras rolled, not the dusty, invisible kind tucked away for records, but the bright, merciless glare of live broadcast. For once, the institution that prided itself on command had no place to hide. Everyone watching expected order, the same mechanical rhythm of questions, objections, and rulings. But that day, a crack formed in the foundation, and through it slipped a moment that no one expected, the moment the judge himself got called out, live on air. From the very start, there was tension in the room. The case at hand wasn't just about one person, one incident, or even one verdict. It was a clash of narratives, of power against voice, of the robed figure behind the bench against the raw honesty of a witness who refused to fold. The audience watching from their screens didn't see a routine proceeding. They saw a performance, a stage where the script went off track. And when the judge tried to steer it back to the usual rules, someone else dared to break those rules completely. The moment unfolded with the kind of pacing that only live television can gift. You could feel the buildup in the witnesses' pauses, in the prosecutor's stumbles, in the murmurs that ran across the courtroom like nervous electricity. It was as if everyone sensed something was about to snap, but no one knew from which direction. The judge leaned forward, perhaps thinking authority could compress the air, could make defiance shrink into silence. But authority met its mirror image, truth spoken without fear. And then, with eyes steady and voice cutting through the static of procedure, the witness looked straight ahead, not at the lawyers, not at the audience, but directly at the judge. The words landed not as a plea, not as a defense, but as a declaration. You don't get to decide what truth looks like when you've been shielding lies. The courtroom froze. For a heartbeat, the gavel was useless. The judge blinked, caught not by evidence, not by legal trickery, but by exposure. Everyone watching knew they weren't just seeing a case anymore. They were seeing a man who had long operated behind robes and rules, suddenly face the same scrutiny he had always imposed on others. The balance flipped. The powerful was now the questioned. What made the moment so electric wasn't just the boldness of the statement. It was the contrast. For years, judges have been portrayed as the untouchable referees of truth. Their words end debates, their tone silences resistance. But here, live, uncut, and unedited, that image cracked. The witness wasn't polished, wasn't rehearsed. They were raw, speaking with the urgency of someone who had nothing left to lose. And that rawness cut deeper than any polished closing argument ever could. The viewers at home didn't need subtitles to understand what was happening. They leaned forward, some in disbelief, some in exhilaration, as if history had decided to peel back its curtain for a moment. People know when authority trembles. They know when someone in power is confronted with their own reflection. And as the silence dragged on, as the judge tried to recover with his practiced authority, the truth had already been planted. There's a reason moments like this live longer than the cases themselves. They touch something bigger than law or politics. They remind people of the fragile contract between power and accountability. When the robes become shields, when the bench becomes a throne, the voice that calls it out becomes a kind of justice in itself. That's what the audience felt that day. Not just the details of a trial, but the spectacle of power being stripped down in real time. What followed was chaos. The prosecutor scrambled to redirect. The defense shifted in their chair, half smirk, half concern. Reporters in the back scribbled as if they were writing history. And through it all, the judge's authority no longer felt absolute. Every ruling after that moment carried the shadow of the call-out, as if the robe itself had been punctured. But beyond the courtroom, the clips spread like wildfire. Phones buzzed, timelines filled, and the phrase, "Did you see the judge get called out?" became the question of the night. It wasn't just entertainment. It was vindication for people who had long believed that authority hides cracks. Here, live on air, the crack was undeniable. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because what makes such a moment powerful is not just the call-out itself, but what comes after. How authority tries to reclaim its ground, how the public reshapes the narrative, and how truth finds its own stage even when rules are stacked against it. What happens after a silence like that? the kind that stretches out long enough for people to realize something irreversible just happened. In that courtroom, the silence wasn't empty. It was charged, like the hum in the air before a storm breaks. The judge, for all his experience, couldn't mask the flicker in his eyes. He shifted in his seat, as if leaning back might somehow reclaim the ground he had just lost. But power, once exposed, doesn't slide back into place so easily. The witness had forced the air open, and now everyone present was breathing a different atmosphere. The prosecutor coughed, cleared their throat, tried to push forward with the next question, but the rhythm was gone. You can't orchestrate control when the audience has already seen the conductor stumble. The defense attorney, sensing the shift, sat straighter, perhaps calculating whether to capitalize on this unexpected tilt of power. Every move, every word now carried more weight than before because the room was no longer just a courtroom. It was a stage of reckoning. The viewers watching live felt it too. Chat feeds buzzed, news tickers scrambled, and within minutes, clips began circulating online. People weren't just replaying the words spoken. They were replaying the judge's pause, the way his jaw tightened, the split second where authority looked human, fallible, caught. And that's where the narrative took root. This wasn't simply a trial anymore. This was the spectacle of justice itself being judged. But let's step back for a moment. Why did it matter so much? Why did this one sentence, this single act of defiance, ripple so widely? The answer lies in contrast. The judge represented the polished, the institutional, the rehearsed script of authority. The witness represented the raw, the unfiltered, the uncontrolled. People are used to seeing institutions dominate individuals. But when the script flips, when the individual stands up, unshaken, and calls out the very system meant to intimidate them, it's more than drama. It's revelation. This is why audiences couldn't look away. It wasn't just about law. It was about dignity versus arrogance, truth versus performance, power versus accountability. Every viewer who had ever felt silenced by authority saw themselves in that witness. Every person who had ever doubted whether the system was fair felt a flicker of hope in seeing someone dare to challenge it. And that's why the judge's reaction, or lack of reaction, became the real headline. As the hearing staggered forward, the judge tried to recover. He reminded the room of decorum. He raised his voice just slightly louder than before. He leaned heavier on his gavel as though wood striking wood could erase the memory of what had been said. But each effort rang hollow. The witness, now emboldened, answered questions without flinching, their tone steady, their eyes unwavering. The authority that once belonged solely to the bench now hung in the air, shared, fractured. Reporters later described the scene as unprecedented, though anyone watching live didn't need headlines to tell them that. You could feel history being written in real time. Not because a verdict was about to change the world, but because the world was reminded that verdicts don't define justice. Truth does, and truth has a way of cutting through even the thickest robes. The aftermath outside the courtroom was just as telling. Commentators debated on air whether the judge had been unfairly attacked or rightfully challenged. Some called the witness reckless, others hailed them as courageous. But beneath the noise, one fact remained undeniable. The institution had been shaken. When the symbol of authority is exposed on its own stage, the echo is louder than any ruling could ever be. And here lies the deeper irony. The very platform meant to project the judge's power, live television, became the tool that amplified his vulnerability. Without edits, without spin, without filters, the audience saw the unguarded moment in its rawest form. In a way, the camera became the great equalizer. It didn't favor the powerful. It didn't shield the embarrassed. It simply broadcast what was, and what was could not be undone. The story spread beyond legal circles, beyond political debates. It seeped into everyday conversations, workplace chatter, family dinners, late-night scrolls through social feeds. Because moments like this are never just about the courtroom. They about the universal hunger to see accountability play out in the open. People are drawn to spectacles where the mighty are made to answer, where the silence of authority is pierced by the courage of voice. And so what began as one witness's bold sentence became a cultural flashpoint. Memes emerged within hours. Hashtags trended. Clips were dissected frame by frame, as if each twitch of the judge's face held hidden meaning. This is how modern audiences engage with truth, not just as passive observers, but as participants, reshaping the narrative through their reactions, their shares, their relentless replay of the moment that cracked the facade. Yet, as powerful as the clip was, it left a lingering question. What happens next? Authority doesn't vanish quietly. It regroups, recalibrates, reasserts itself. And the judge, humiliated but not defeated, still had the gavel in hand. The witness had scored a blow, yes, but the battle between dignity and power was far from over, and that's where the story deepens. Because when someone dares to expose what lies beneath authority, the game changes, not just in the room, but in the culture beyond it. By the time the hearing moved into its next phase, the tension had taken on a life of its own. You could see it in the faces of everyone present. The lawyers who now measured every word, the clerks who shuffled papers a little too quickly, the spectators who dared not whisper for fear of drawing attention. The atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was theater, and everyone knew the cameras weren't just documenting, they were exposing. The judge attempted to press forward, leaning heavier on procedural language, as though wrapping himself in the rules would restore his control. But rules once questioned no longer feel invincible. Each time he spoke, the witness's earlier call-out seemed to echo in the background, undermining every syllable. And the audience at home? They picked up on it instantly. They weren't just watching law, they were watching psychology, a battle of presence, of who owned the space more convincingly. This is the thing about live television. You can't rewind reality in the moment. A stumble stays a stumble, a pause stays a pause, and the viewers, hungry for authenticity, latch onto those cracks with ferocity. What they saw now was a judge trying to hold together an image that had already fractured. The robe was still there, the gavel still in hand, but the illusion of invulnerability had evaporated. The witness, on the other hand, seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. Every answer they gave carried a subtle defiance, a reminder that they weren't cowed by the courtroom's hierarchy. It wasn't just what they said, it was how they said it. Calm, steady, unshaken. That demeanor alone became its own form of power, one that no gavel could silence. Commentators later described this dynamic as a role reversal. Typically, witnesses are the ones under pressure, scrutinized, cornered by lawyers, disciplined by judges. But here, the dynamic flipped. The judge became the one under the microscope, his every gesture dissected not for legal meaning, but for signs of discomfort, of weakness. And the witness, instead of shrinking under pressure, expanded into the space that authority had inadvertently ceded. It was in many ways the perfect storm for viral attention. People are drawn to contradiction. They are captivated when the expected order is turned upside down. That's why the clip spread beyond legal junkies and political commentators. It captured the universal drama of the powerless standing up to the powerful, and doing it in real time. Social media exploded with reactions. Some framed the witness as a modern-day truth-teller, a David against the Goliath of the system. Others turned the judge into a meme, frozen mid-blink, captioned with words like, "When you realize the script flipped." But beyond the humor, there was a deeper current of discussion. What does it mean when the very guardians of justice are themselves called into question? That question ignited debates across dinner tables and television panels alike. Was the witness reckless or brave? Did they undermine the system? Or did they breathe life back into it by daring to confront hypocrisy? No matter which side people landed on, one fact united them. They couldn't stop talking about it. And the judge? He knew the walls were closing in. With cameras capturing his every twitch, every overcompensated command, he had little room to maneuver. Authority thrives on unquestioned obedience, but once doubt enters the room, it multiplies. Each ruling he made afterward carried not the weight of law, but the suspicion of bias. Was he trying to punish defiance? Was he trying to save face? Every action became suspect. It is important to note here that moments like this don't just shape perception, they shape memory. People rarely remember the details of legal arguments. They don't recall line numbers from transcripts or the precise technicalities of objections. What they remember are moments. A sentence. a silence, a stare. And this trial had just produced one of those moments, the kind that etches itself into the cultural memory far beyond the case itself. That's the irony of authority. It's strongest when it goes unquestioned. But the second it's challenged in a way that resonates with the public, its permanence collapses. And no one knew that better than the judge, who now faced the impossible task of restoring what had been shattered. The rest of the hearing became a tug-of-war. Each attempt to impose control felt thinner, more forced. The gavel struck harder, but the sound carried less meaning. The legal jargon flowed, but the audience had already tuned into a different channel. The human drama of exposure, of power, destabilized. And once the public sees authority stumble, they rarely allow it to stand untarnished again. Beyond the courtroom, the story kept snowballing. Talk shows analyzed the body language. Editorials framed it as a symbolic reckoning. Protesters outside the courthouse waved signs not about the case itself, but about accountability, justice, transparency. The witness had inadvertently ignited something larger than themselves. They hadn't just called out a judge. They had reminded people that power is fragile, and truth, when spoken boldly, can reverberate far beyond four walls. And here's the deeper layer. The system doesn't like being exposed. It resists it, punishes it, tries to bury it. So the real drama was never just the call-out. It was the aftermath, the inevitable clash between exposure and suppression. Because once truth escapes into the public, the system has two choices: reckon with it or try to crush it. And the judge, cornered yet still clinging to authority, seemed ready to choose the latter. But truth, once unleashed, has a way of refusing to die quietly. The courtroom's rhythm had changed forever, but the day wasn't done testing just how far authority could bend before it broke. With each passing minute, the judge's veneer of control wore thinner. His gavel strikes came sharper. His tone carried a forced sharpness, almost desperate, as though raising his voice could drown out the echo of that one unforgettable line. But authority doesn't recover through volume. It recovers through presence. And presence was exactly what he had lost. The witness, meanwhile, remained composed, seated firmly, not shrinking, not wavering. Every time they spoke, their words seemed to ripple outward with a weight that surpassed the case itself. Observers in the courtroom shifted in their seats, some glancing cautiously at the judge, others at the cameras that hung overhead, documenting every second. What should have been a conventional hearing had transformed into something rawer, something far less controllable, a referendum on power itself. The prosecutor, flustered, tried to redirect with mechanical questions, but the life had drained from their performance. They looked less like the wielder of the state's authority, and more like a weary actor stumbling through forgotten lines. The defense attorney, however, saw an opening. Sensing the shift, they leaned into questions that highlighted inconsistencies in the process, probing not just the witness but the integrity of the courtroom itself. It was subtle at first, but the message was unmistakable. If even the judge could be challenged, why not the entire proceeding? For the audience at home, the spectacle grew more gripping by the second. This wasn't dry legal procedure. It was theater with stakes. Social feeds buzzed with live reactions. "Did you just see that?" The judge looked shook. Finally, someone spoke truth to power. The clip of the call-out was already viral, but now new clips emerged. The judge fumbling over words, the gavel slamming harder than usual, the witness's calm face in stark contrast. Each moment fed the narrative that authority was unraveling before their eyes. And that's the brilliance and danger of live broadcast. The system couldn't edit. It couldn't spin. It could not hide the tremor in the judge's hand or the flicker of unease on his face. Once those images hit the public, they became symbols, far larger than the moment itself. The trial was no longer just about guilt or innocence. It was about a system on display, its flaws magnified for millions to witness. Commentators outside the courthouse quickly latched onto the symbolism. Some painted the moment as a crack in the facade of justice long overdue. Others insisted the witness had crossed a line, undermining respect for the institution. But either way, they agreed on one thing: the judge had lost something that couldn't be easily regained. Respect, once shaken in the public eye, doesn't simply return with a command. Inside the room, You could feel the power dynamics shifting in real time. The audience, those quiet rows of people usually invisible during hearings, now held their breath as if they too were part of the drama. They weren't looking at the lawyers. They weren't even looking at the witness anymore. Their eyes were locked on the judge, searching for signs of composure, of authority restored. But each attempt to assert dominance only reminded them of the moment it had cracked. It's worth noting how rare this is. Judges operate in a space designed to protect them from exposure. Their robes, their benches, their rituals, all are crafted to create distance, to elevate them above scrutiny. But on that day, live on air, the rituals collapsed. The distance shrank, and the man behind the robe was revealed, not as untouchable, but as human, vulnerable, even rattled. That revelation, more than anything said in testimony, became the real story. As the hearing wore on, the witness continued to answer questions, steady as stone. Each word they spoke carried the subtle defiance of someone who knew they had already won. Not the case, perhaps, but something larger. The moment. You could see it in the way they sat, unbothered by the judge's sharp tones, immune to the prosecutor's interruptions. Their power didn't come from the law. It came from truth, and truth, once spoken boldly, has a way of filling the room. By contrast, the judge's performance grew brittle. He leaned heavily on protocol, reciting rules, correcting phrasing, striking down objections with exaggerated precision. But the more he clung to the rituals of authority, the more obvious it became that they were a shield, not a sword. The robe no longer symbolized strength, it symbolized fragility. Outside, the media frenzy only grew louder. Protesters gathered, not chanting about the details of the trial, but about accountability in the system. Editorials framed the call-out as a watershed moment, a reminder that no figure of authority should be beyond reproach. Hashtags multiplied. Memes exaggerated the judge's stunned expression, but beneath the humor was a deeper sentiment. People were hungry for moments that revealed the cracks in power. And yet, beneath the viral buzz and cultural commentary, something darker brewed. Because power rarely accepts humiliation without retaliation. The judge, though shaken, still held the gavel, still presided over the case, still controlled the immediate proceedings. And while the world outside may have been celebrating a rare moment of exposure, inside the courtroom, authority began to reassert itself, not through presence, but through force. The stage was set for the next clash, one that would reveal whether the call-out was a spark or the beginning of a firestorm. If the earlier moments had cracked the image of authority, what followed was the system's attempt to patch it back together. The judge, his voice clipped and deliberate, began asserting stricter control over the courtroom. He interrupted more frequently, cut off attorneys mid-sentence, and reminded everyone, sometimes unnecessarily, of the rules of order. It was as though he believed that if he could drown the room in legal procedure, people might forget the tremor that had revealed him moments earlier. But the truth is, once an audience sees vulnerability, they never unsee it. And this audience wasn't just the people inside the courtroom, it was millions watching live. Every attempt to overcompensate, every sharp correction, every exaggerated strike of the gavel was broadcast to the world, where it was replayed, dissected, and criticized. Instead of regaining control, he looked like a man desperate to hold on to it. The witness, however, seemed untouchable. They had already landed their blow, and the air around them carried a different weight now. Each answer was firm without being aggressive, pointed without being reckless. The very act of remaining calm in the face of escalating pressure amplified their credibility. Where the judge strained, the witness appeared effortless. The contrast grew sharper with every exchange. Meanwhile, the prosecutor fumbled on, their rhythm shattered. At one point, their papers slipped from the desk, scattering across the floor. The defense attorney smirked, the audience gasped softly, and the cameras caught it all. Small moments like that don't usually matter in the grand machinery of justice. But in a live broadcast, every slip is magnified. The public, already primed to see cracks in authority, latched onto these details as evidence that the entire proceeding was crumbling. What made this moment resonate so deeply wasn't just the spectacle, it was the symbolism. The courtroom, long seen as the arena where truth is filtered and shaped by procedure, had turned into the place where truth broke free, raw and unfiltered. The judge's robe, meant to project dignity, now looked like a costume too heavy for the man wearing it. And the witness, who should have been the smallest voice in the room, had become the loudest, even when speaking softly. Beyond the courtroom walls, the narrative was rewriting itself in real time. News outlets scrambled to keep up. Clips flooded timelines. Hashtags trended with phrases like "Mosh judge called out" and "Mosh truth on air." Analysts on evening panels argued whether the witness's defiance was a crack in the system or a sign of its resilience. For some, it was proof that justice still had space for honesty. For others, it was proof that the system itself was crumbling. Either way, the conversation had shifted permanently. The judge knew this too. He could feel the weight of the cameras, the scrutiny of the press, the invisible eyes of millions. And so, his rulings became harsher, his demeanor colder, as though doubling down on authority could erase the memory of being called out. But each heavy-handed decision only deepened the impression that he was rattled, lashing out not from strength, but from bruised pride. The witness's composure, in contrast, became the stuff of legend. Their calmness spread through the courtroom like an unspoken challenge. You can raise your voice, you can slam your gavel, but you can't erase what has already been said. And in that defiance, they captured something larger than themselves. They became a stand-in for every person who had ever faced down authority and refused to shrink. Social media lit up with comparisons to historic moments of defiance: the lone figure before the tank, the whistleblower who refused to fold, the voices that pierced silence in times of oppression. Was it the same scale? Of course not. But the symbolism mattered. People crave stories where truth triumphs, even if just for a moment, over the machinery of power. And here, live on air, they had seen it with their own eyes. The defense attorney, recognizing the shift, began to sharpen their strategy. Instead of challenging the witness, they turned their fire toward the process itself, subtly weaving the judge's rattled demeanor into their argument. Every objection became a reminder of bias. Every correction was reframed as overreach. It wasn't just about defending their client anymore. It was about putting the very system on trial. And the judge, whether he realized it or not, was playing into their hands. His sternness, his impatience, his clipped tone, all of it painted a picture of authority overextended, authority cracking under pressure. For a man who had spent his career avoiding scrutiny, he was now the centerpiece of it. Outside, crowds gathered, emboldened by what they had seen. Protesters carried signs not about the specifics of the trial, but about accountability and transparency. News vans lined the streets. Commentators framed the day not as a legal proceeding, but as a cultural event. And through it all, the clip of the witness's call-out played again and again, looping endlessly, imprinting itself onto the public consciousness. The courtroom may have been bound by rules, but the world outside was not. And that world had already decided what this moment meant. The untouchable had been touched, the unquestionable had been questioned, and the silence of power had been pierced. Still, the battle wasn't over, because when power is cornered, it doesn't retreat quietly. It recalculates, it hardens, it prepares to strike back. And as the day drew to a close, one truth became clear. The judge wasn't finished. He was wounded, yes, but he still had weapons left to wield. The question was, how far would he go to reclaim what he had lost? As the courtroom edged into the later hours, the atmosphere felt heavier, almost suffocating. The air carried the residue of what had been said earlier, the unshakable moment when authority cracked, and everyone inside knew they were witnessing something that would outlive the trial itself. The judge, seated high above, wore his robe like armor, but the way his fingers tapped the bench betrayed the storm brewing beneath. He wasn't just presiding anymore, he was fighting to recover dignity. The defense attorney, sensing the fragility, pressed harder. Their questions became sharper, their tone emboldened, their strategy unmistakable, exposed not just inconsistencies in the case, but the instability of the man overseeing it. Every time the judge snapped back with a correction, The attorney would pause just a second too long, letting the silence underline his irritation. For the cameras, it was theater. For the jury of public opinion outside, it was confirmation. The robe could no longer shield the man. Meanwhile, the prosecutor scrambled to stitch control back together. They leaned on objections, procedural reminders, anything that could restore the flow. But the more they tried, the more the imbalance showed. Authority had shifted, and no amount of courtroom mechanics could hide it. The spotlight, once trained firmly on the witness, now hovered over the judge, magnifying his every move. The witness, unshaken, sat with a poise that bordered on defiant calm. Each answer was clear, each gaze steady. They no longer needed to raise their voice or repeat their earlier declaration. The silence around them carried the weight of truth already spoken. And that silence, multiplied by millions watching live, was louder than any gavel. Outside the walls, the reaction had exploded into something uncontainable. Networks replayed the clip on a loop, panels debated its significance, and social media turned it into a cultural spectacle. The phrase "called out" became shorthand for accountability, splashed across headlines, hashtags, and late-night comedy routines. Even those who hadn't seen the trial live now knew its defining moment. But inside, a different kind of storm gathered. Because power doesn't simply surrender. It recalibrates. The judge leaned harder into his role, not with presence, but with punishment. Rulings grew harsher. Objections from the defense were overruled in quick succession, sometimes before they were fully voiced. The tone of his instructions grew clipped, almost cutting. Each word carried not the cool authority of law, but the sharpness of wounded pride. This was the danger. When authority feels exposed, it often lashes out not to restore justice, but to restore itself. And the audience could see it. Viewers at home, already primed to question, interpreted every decision through that lens. He's just trying to save face. That's bias, plain and simple. He's not ruling, he's retaliating. The trust that once cloaked the bench had evaporated, replaced with suspicion that spread like wildfire. The defense attorney, clever and composed, knew exactly how to use this. Each overreach by the judge became fuel for their argument. This was not just a trial, it was a broken system, struggling to contain a truth it couldn't control. And the cameras, impartial and unblinking, captured it all. What made the spectacle so powerful wasn't just the clash of personalities, but the symbolism. On one side, a judge in his robe, clinging to ritual and hierarchy. On the other, a witness who had stripped that ritual bare with a single sentence. It was authority versus authenticity, performance versus truth. And the audience knew instinctively which side felt real. The prosecutor's frustration mounted. Their role, once supported by the invisible weight of judicial backing, now felt exposed too. Without the unquestioned authority of the bench, their case stumbled under the weight of public perception. They could press forward with facts, evidence, testimony, but perception, once shifted, is the most powerful force in the room. And perception had already crowned the witness the victor of the day. Commentators later described this sequence as the unraveling, the moment when authority, once absolute, began collapsing under its own weight. Every attempt to tighten control only revealed more cracks. Every display of power highlighted its fragility. And the witness's steady presence reminded everyone of the line that started it all. A challenge too bold to erase, too raw to ignore. Beyond the cameras, the crowds outside swelled. Signs bearing slogans like "Truth First" and "Power Answerable" filled the streets. Interviews with onlookers revealed the sentiment that had taken hold. This wasn't about one judge, one witness, or one case. It was about accountability itself. People weren't rallying for a verdict, they were rallying for a principle. And yet, even as the world outside celebrated, those inside the courtroom felt the shift toward something darker. The judge, stripped of composure, wasn't going to let the day end in humiliation. The law gave him tools, the robe gave him cover, and pride gave him motive. Every sharp ruling, every dismissal of objection, every cold glare at the defense hinted at the same truth. He would not forget being exposed, and he would not let it pass without consequence. This is where the drama sharpened into something more than spectacle. Because while truth may shake authority, authority still holds the gavel, and when wounded, it becomes unpredictable. As the proceedings drew to a close, the air inside the courtroom was thick, heavy with everything unsaid. The judge's face remained stern, but the earlier crack in his authority lingered like a shadow. He had struck the gavel countless times, corrected voices, overruled objections, but none of it erased the truth that had slipped through earlier. Authority, once fractured in public, is never quite whole again. The witness, still poised, didn't need to speak another defiant line. Their silence carried just as much weight as their words had hours before. Each glance they gave toward the bench reminded everyone watching that the call-out had already changed the balance. They had exposed the vulnerability of power, and no ruling, no order, no raised voice could rewind that moment. The lawyers closed with their arguments, but their words felt secondary. The real drama wasn't in the evidence, or the motions, or the fine print of the law. It was in the human spectacle that had unfolded, a witness daring to confront the very figure meant to intimidate them, and the figure cracking under the spotlight of truth. Viewers at home didn't wait for verdicts. They already had one. They logged off their streams, turned off their televisions, with the image burned into memory, the robe shaken, the gavel powerless, the truth unafraid. And as they carried that image into conversations, into posts, into headlines, the meaning of the trial stretched far beyond the case. The media framed it as a watershed moment. Commentators debated endlessly about whether the witness had undermined or upheld justice. But the public's verdict was simpler. They had seen power humbled, live, with no edits and no spin. And for many, that was enough to reignite the belief that truth, even when cornered, can still find its voice. The judge, for all his efforts to reclaim dignity, left the bench that day under a different kind of spotlight. Not the spotlight of authority, but of scrutiny. Every case he presided over afterward would carry the ghost of that moment. Every ruling would be second-guessed. Every silence would be remembered. Once the curtain is pulled back, the illusion doesn't return. It lingers as a reminder that power is always fragile. And the witness? They became more than a name in a transcript. They became a symbol. A reminder of what it looks like when someone refuses to bow. Their words echoed not just in the courtroom but across living rooms, news studios, and digital feeds. In calling out the judge, they had called out something larger. The idea that authority exists without accountability. That's why the story lived on. Not because of legal technicalities, but because people are hungry for moments where the powerless stand tall, where truth interrupts performance, where dignity confronts arrogance. This trial gave them that moment, raw and unfiltered, beamed live into millions of homes. And in the end, that moment became bigger than any verdict could ever be. When the judge got called out live on air, the system's script unraveled. What remained was the reminder that justice is not about robes or gavels, but about truth, and truth, when spoken boldly, has the power to pierce even the thickest armor of authority.